and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Entertainment Network. I am your host, Sarah. I am delighted to be back with you on the actual Tuesday this week, unlike the last couple, to bring you another author interview. As we get started, I do want to remind you, as I always do, to please like, follow, subscribe, etc. on whatever platform you are either watching or listening to this podcast on. Your support means a great deal to us. It helps the algorithm. It's wonderful. If you want to support the podcast and the entire network in another way, you can also go to gsmcpodcast.info. You see that not only scrolling at the bottom throughout the episode, but also playing in the video next to me at gsmcpodcast.info. You can leave a tip or a donation. You can also, if you want, leave a question or a comment along with that tip, and I am happy to engage with questions, comments, etc. I will interact with those the next episode after I receive them. So again, if you want to support the podcast in a slightly different way, you can go to gsmcpodcast.info, leave a tip or a donation. Your support is hugely helpful and beneficial to not only, as I said, this podcast, but the network as a whole. I am greatly appreciative of all of the support that you have given, especially me, since it's my podcast. I am greatly appreciative of that support over the years. I so appreciate all of you. How is your week going? I can't believe we are almost at the end of September. I was at a doctor's appointment with a couple of friends yesterday. Same friends that I was helping last week. I went with them to the doctor's appointment just to help coordinate some things, since it's our doctor as well. And the nurse said that she made an appointment, a follow-up appointment. It's October 3rd, and I'm like, that is next week. October 3rd is next week, and that is just crazy to me. Maybe it's not crazy to you. Maybe that's perfectly reasonable. But I'm pretty sure January was roughly 5 minutes ago. So I'm definitely having that time is flying way too fast point in my life. But I hope you had a good weekend. I hope your week is off to a great start. We had a good weekend hanging out with the same friends who are here from the UK. And then a friend of theirs who is also a friend of ours now, but she came with them she left today. So she was just here for the first week, but we love getting to hang out with them. I think I've mentioned before that they love the game Phase 10. I don't know if you've ever played Phase 10, but they love this game. So we play a lot of Phase 10 with them when they are here. And I am terrible at Phase 10. Like, I'll start out really good. We were playing yesterday, and I just kicked rear end in the first few rounds. Like, I went out on my very first go a couple of times. I was kicking butt. I was the furthest ahead. I had the fewest points, because you want the lowest points, but you want to be furthest ahead in the phases. I was doing good. By the time we were done, dead last. I was the first behind. I had the most points. Happens to me every time. But that we get together to hang out and talk and laugh and give each other crap during the game. But I am a terrible Phase 10 player. So if you ever want to win, just make sure that you're playing with me. I think that's some good advice. But let's go ahead and talk about this week's book. As I mentioned at the end of last episode, this week I have a returning author. Bryn Turnbull is joining me. She was on the podcast for the first time back in December of 2023. So if you would like to listen to that episode as well, that was before we went to the video option. So that is audio only. But if you want to listen to that interview, that episode is from December 23rd, 2023. And we talked about her book her book set in World War II, takes place in France. The name just flew right out of my head, but I will make sure that I have it for you. I don't know where my brain is. Somewhere, but not here apparently. I'll make sure I tell you that, but it's December 23rd, 2023 for that episode. In today's interview, we are talking about, of course, her newest book. It is called The Berlin Apartment. This is, again, historical fiction. We've jumped ahead a couple of decades. This starts in 1961 in Berlin, as the title indicates. Let me give you a description of this book. Berlin, 1961, when Uli Neumann proposes to Lise Bauer, she has every reason to accept. He offers her love, respect, and a life beyond the strict bounds of the East German society in which she was raised. which she longs to leave more than anything. But only 2 short days after their engagement, Lisa and Uli are torn violently apart when barbed wire is rolled across Berlin, splitting the city into two hostile halves. Capitalist West Berlin, an island of Western influence isolated far beyond the Iron Curtain, and the Socialist East, a country determined to control its citizens by any means necessary. Soon, Uli and his friends in West Berlin hatch a plan to get Lisa and her unborn child out of East Germany, but as distance and suspicion bleed into their lives, and as weeks turn into months, how long can true love survive in the divided city? That is the description, again, as I said, of the Berlin apartment. It is the book itself takes place over the same amount of time as the Berlin Wall. So the Berlin Wall went up in 1961, literally overnight. I knew that, but when you actually read about it more than just like facts or in a textbook, when you read the something like a historical fiction, and just to see how fast it went up and how quickly you could not get from one side to the other. You were stuck where you were stuck. Is really amazing. And then it goes all the way through 1989 when the wall came down. And I actually remember that. We talk a little bit about this being lived history for both of us, because we both remember when the wall came down, and just what an amazing experience that was to see on the news every day. And but this book, I really enjoyed the last book that we talked about, and but this one just sucked me in. I was hooked. I think I read it in 2 days, so pretty quickly, and would have probably read it quicker if I didn't have other things that kept interfering with work and life and all that stuff, interfering in my reading. But I was sucked in. That plan that they hatched to get Lisa out, and this, the way the tension builds, the tension builds, and then I learned so much about the situation and living in both East and West Berlin, which you see from Lisa's perspective in East Berlin, and then Uli's perspective, and some of their core group of friends who are still in West Berlin. And just the fact that West Berlin is this tiny little West German place, completely surrounded by East Germany, as it said in the description, behind the Iron Curtain. So I really, really enjoyed this book. But let's go ahead and let Bryn talk about the writing of the book and the inspiration behind the story, etc. Again, the book is called The Berlin Apartment. The author is Bryn Turnbull. Hi, Bryn, and welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, thanks so much for having me back. It's lovely to see you.
It's good to see you. Thank you. Last time you were here, it was just audio, so this time I get to see your face, which is nice. Thank you
Likewise.
for returning. We are here to talk about the Berlin Apartment, but before we do, if you wouldn't mind reintroducing yourself to people who maybe heard the first video or interview, and introducing yourself to people who are new.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Bryn Turnbull. I am an author of historical fiction. My first novel, The Woman Before Wallace, chronicled the story of Edward and his relationship with Wallace Simpson and the woman who he left for Wallace. My second was about the fall of the Romanov dynasty. My third was art theft and forgery in Nazi-occupied France. And now I'm back with The Berlin Apartment, which is a story about love, family, and betrayal on both sides of the Berlin Wall.
Yes. And I love how you kind of jump around to not only different countries, but different time periods. You kind of don't have a niche when it comes to historical fiction. Do you just have a wide range of interests, or is there some tie that kind of, a thread that runs through those topics?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I love doing the research and I love kind of like being able to explore a new time and a place. So I find it's whatever the story is, that's what drives me. So I'll find either a historical figure or historical time period, and that's what I want to dive into. So I would say that the thread that ties my stories together, though, um, I would say that that would probably be in the realm of like female friendships and developing like strong female characters.
Mm.
I think one of the things with historical fiction, one of the opportunities that we have as historical fiction authors is to rewrite women back into the historical record, which for far too long has been sort of the purview of men's stories, right? We
Mhm.
always are looking at men's stories and men's exploits, because history, of course, is written by the victors. The
Yep.
victors for far too long have been men. So that for me is really what I love to dive into, is the stories of women who maybe have been lost to the historical record, or whose experiences we don't see reflected
Yeah.
in the history books.
Yeah. I agree. We when you were here last time, we were in 1940s France. We've now moved
Yes, we
a
were.
couple of decades ahead. We are in 1961 in Berlin, Germany. Can you give an overview of the Berlin apartment?
Yeah, so the Berlin apartment opens, as you said, in 1961, in the summer of 1961, with a young couple, Uli and Lise. They live on opposite sides of the invisible divide between East and West Berlin. In 1961, in early 1961, the fact that the city was divided was not an issue. There was still free movement in the city itself. In August of 1961, that all came to a close when the wall went up literally overnight. Barbed wire was just rolled down the middle of Berlin, down all of these little streets, and you could not move from your side of the city to the other. So we have this young couple, they get engaged, and the wall goes up between them basically 2 days after 2 days after their engagement. So the whole story takes place over the course of the wall's existence, as they fight to return to each other, and as they sort of strive to live their lives that have been irrevocably changed by sort of political powers and political machinations outside their own control.
Yeah. And one thing that I love about historical fiction is that it gives you that really personal insight into a time period that you maybe know
Mm-hmm.
some facts about, right? And I had forgotten that the wall didn't go up until 1961. Like you kind of think about World War II and the wall, and you maybe don't really think about the time period and the fact that it really just literally goes up overnight. Um,
Yeah.
but just the you get, and then you get these two perspectives. What always fascinated me was, I understand East and West Germany, but the fact that Berlin, the city itself, is fully in East Germany. You've got this
Yep.
little pocket of West Germany in the West. The fact that they split Berlin, I've always been amazed by that. And the fact that it had to have been like, we'll talk about East and West and Lisa and Uli's experiences, but just, I can't quite imagine living in West Germany in the middle of East Germany, just completely surrounded. So that must have been kind of fascinating to research.
It really was. It really was. And I like you, I kind of I hadn't really grasped the significance of that. Berlin was a city behind the Iron Curtain. It
Right.
really was. And West Berlin became this little enclave of Western influence behind the Iron Curtain. So what happened at the end of the war, Berlin was split up into four zones of occupation: the British, French, Americans, and the Soviet Union all split the city between them. And basically, from 1945 onwards, there was this power struggle about what Berlin was going to be, whether Western capitalism or Soviet communism was going to be the dominant economic and social and cultural presence in the city. And because of its position so far in East Germany proper, the West really saw it almost as a propaganda exercise. They saw that here was an opportunity to spread Western ideology to the East. And so they would fly in sort of, the best of the best that capitalism had to offer, really. And what ended up happening was East East Germans and the Soviets got very uncomfortable with that, and that really is why the wall ended up going up, was because all of these people in East Germany in particular, in East Berlin in particular, it wasn't like capitalism was some far removed ideological thought experiment, right? It was in their backyard.
Yeah.
And they could see very clearly what capitalism was and the opportunities that it afforded beyond the communist system. And so that's why people started to flee. And that's why Berlin ended up being really sort of West Berlin ended up being hemmed off by this wall that encircled it. we think about the Berlin Wall as this thing that was meant to keep West Berliners out. It was really meant to keep East Berliners in.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of that was kind of the communications challenge, if you want to call it that, for East Germany, was how to position this as like, this is against Western incursion and not, this is a measure that we're taking to keep our own people here because everybody is fleeing.
Yeah. I think what Bryn said there about the wall being really, rather than keeping East Germans in, it was really built against Western influence, the Western incursion, capitalist ideologies, etc. I think that's an important way to frame it, and you really do see that through the stories that we are told through Lisa and her family, and through Uli and their friends in West Germany. You definitely get that personalization in this story, and it is a really good way to get to understand a period of history that you may know a lot about. Maybe you don't know as much about it, but historical fiction is a great way to learn potentially new things about a period of history that you didn't know. The first book that we talked about, that episode on December 23rd of last year, is called The Paris Deception. Of course, I knew this, but did my brain want to give you that information earlier? No. But I just wanted to make sure that I said that it's The Paris Deception. I like that they both have the same number of syllables. The Paris Deception, the Berlin Apartment. Again, weird brain. We're going to go ahead and take our first break of this episode. When we come back, we'll be talking more about that ideology and the personalization of the stories, and how we learn more about this time period. You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to work, cause my boss is a jerk, and I'm not even that paid. I need a change in my life, cause I don't feel alive, and there's nothing that makes me happy. Hold my beer for a minute, I'm about to quit my job, cash in for a ticket. I'm going on a trip and I don't plan to visit. I'm gonna stay there till I feel like I'm winning, and this is just the beginning. I need a big change, help me feel like living. I need a big swing, home runs I'm hitting, and I'll never look back, moving on till I get it all. And we all got dreams, we all want things, but what you gonna do for it? How you gonna move for it? What you gonna be? And do you believe you can do anything?
Welcome back to GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with author Bryn Turnbull. Just a really quick reminder, if you want to support the podcast in a monetary fashion, you can do so by going to gsmcpodcast.info and leave a tip or a donation. That helps not only the podcast itself, the book review podcast, but it helps the network as a whole. And we have over 800 podcasts on the network. So again, that website is gsmcpodcast.info if you would like to leave a tip or a donation. Before the break, Bryn was talking about a little bit about the ideology behind the wall, and that it was keeping Western incursion out. And I was saying that you really do see the personalization of that through the stories, especially through Lisa and Uli's stories, which we're about to talk more about. So let's go ahead and return to the conversation with Bryn. And you really get that, again, that personalization, because in the beginning, Lisa is going to university in West Berlin. She wants to be a doctor. East Germany wants her to be something else within that system. She wants to be a doctor. So she's able to go to university, and then suddenly that's just done. So you get to see the personalization of these experiences. Talk a little bit both about Uli and Lisa as the main characters. What about them is going to resonate with readers?
Yeah. So Lisa, one of the reasons I really found myself interested in Lisa's story was because she was what's called a Grenzgänger. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that properly, but Grenzgänger was an Easterner who worked in the West, who would cross the border every day and go and basically become ideologically aligned to Western thought. And so Lisa, as the student, ends up going to the West because she's not able to get the education she wants in the East. And this happened all the time. So Lise is a young woman. She's in medical school. She wants to be a doctor, and that's what she's in school for. Is she sees a life where she can, she can live this life as a doctor. That's her only goal until she meets Uli. Uli's also a student at the Free University. He is from West Berlin. He is, he's one of those annoyingly optimistic people. He's always looking for the silver lining in the cloud. And when she meets him, she falls in love. And she wasn't kind of planning to fall in love with anybody, let alone somebody from the West. And when she meets him, she realizes that the life that she wants to lead is in West Berlin or in West Germany or beyond. She realizes that this is the life she wants, and this is the man that she wants to live her life with. And so, in terms of what's going to resonate with people, I think theirs is a love story where it's immediate. They meet each other. That's it. They know that they are meant to be together. There's never any doubt in either of their minds that this is the person that they want to be with. And then the wall goes up. And what do you do in that situation where it's like, beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is the person that you were meant to live your life with, but you can't.
Mm-hmm.
And they're in the same city. You can see them across this wall. It's called the Berlin apartment because Uli buys an apartment that's right on the border so that Lise can live in the West, but still be close to her family in the East. And so her family's apartment and his family apartment, they face each other on opposite sides of the wall. And so what do you do in that situation where you can see the person, you can see the life that you want to live, and you can't because of circumstances completely outside your control? That was really what I wanted to explore, is what are these people going to do to be together? And what are they going to do if they can't be together? How does that change who they are? How does that change sort of the trajectory of their lives?
Yeah. And there are 4 friends in West Germany who decide that they're going to attempt to get not only Lisa, but other people out of East Germany by digging a tunnel, which is based on an actual event. There were lots of different ways that people planned. Did you know about that when you started? Was that kind of a place that you jumped off from, or did that come about in research? How did that play into the overall story?
Well, one of the things we were talking about at the top of the conversation was sort of how do you get inspired by a story, right? Like where is the sort of the entry point into a book? And for me, the entry point into this story was the students who dug these tunnels. So I'd been listening to a podcast called Tunnel 29, Intrigue Tunnel 29. And it was all about one of these tunnels that was dug in Bernauer Strasse, which is it's a neighborhood that was right on the Berlin Wall. And it was a group of students from the Free University. They were engineers. And when this tunnel was, when the wall went up, they dug tunnels underneath it to rescue friends and family. And actually NBC ended up filming one of the escapes that happened as a result of these tunnels being built. So for me, that was just such a striking thing. Looking at this, what would drive somebody to do that? To look at an injustice that's happening and say, I'm not going to live with it. And not only am I not going to live with it, but I'm going to resist, and I'm going to resist in an incredibly physical and almost sacrificial way. This was an incredibly dangerous thing to do. These were kids digging tunnels beneath a wall that is there. The ground was seeded with listening devices, so that the East German border guards, if one of these devices got triggered, they'd just drop a grenade and they'd collapse the tunnel. Beyond that, just the physical sort of mechanics of digging these things, they were prone to collapse. They were prone to oxygen running out.
Yeah.
And so I really, it struck me that people were so brave and so willing to do the right thing to, rescue friends and family, and not even just friends and family, but strangers. I think one of the things that really kind of drove my conception of Uli and of these students was, you got to bear in mind, these would have been very small children during the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
And so living through sort of the reconstruction of Berlin, these are all sort of, these students, they're all in their 20s in 1961. So living through kind of the reconstruction of Berlin and living through what their parents' generation had done in the war, I think gave a lot of them a very strong sense of conviction and a very strong sense of what was right and what was wrong. And so for me, with Uli, one of the things he says in the book is your generation, to his parents, he says, you know, your generation messed things up and mine's not going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that that was just such a compelling thing. This notion of like, we're not going to make that mistake again. We're not going to sit back while injustice occurs again.
Yeah.
We're going to take history and we're going to break that cycle.
Well, and you mentioned that the book spans the life of the wall. So we have 3 decades from the 60s to the late 80s. But because, as you just mentioned, there's so much influence from World War II, it really kind of takes place from the 40s through. So talk about writing a novel that really does cover basically 5 decades in different ways, and figuring out what to include and how to do flashbacks, and just what's the process for you for figuring those timelines out?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was figuring out the characters, and then it was figuring out. Obviously, I knew that I wanted the book to span the entirety of the wall's existence. That was like a non-negotiable for me. Was like it's going to start in August 1961, and it's going to end when the wall comes down. I knew that was going to happen from the get-go. But you know, I find when it comes to building your characters, you always have to be doing an excavation as well as you're climbing the mountain a little bit, because you have to understand how you have to understand history in order to develop a character that feels authentically rooted in their context. So for me, knowing, okay, these students, you know, Uli and Lise are 20 years old, and one of them's grown up in West Germany, one of them's or West Berlin, one's growing up in East Germany. How did they get there? How does that past define who they are? How does that influence the choices that they and their friends and family make throughout? You have to be able to go back and look at sort of what was that major trauma in all of their, what was the collective major trauma in all of their lives that has shaped them into the people that they are today. And for all of them, it was the Second World War. So I think it's incredibly important to, when you're developing characters, to build them around the context that they're living in, and allow that context to inform who they are, as opposed to saying, well, I want a character and I'm going to put them here because that seems like an interesting time and place. That time and place, it's never going to feel authentic unless you start doing the dig and looking at, okay, who are they? How does their past shape the decisions that they make now?
Yeah. And Uli and Lise as the main characters are really important to see these two different sides. But I think even more so, we see the difference between East and West in their children, because they grew up fully in the division. And so you really see Western versus Eastern. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, those not relationships, but the contrast between their children?
So it's interesting. You're the first person to ask me about that. So well done. I always love getting a new question. So yeah, with Uli and Lise, their 2 children come as a result of their separation. Rudy, who is Lisa's son, with Uli, they have one special night of passion before the wall goes up, and it results in a little boy. And he grows up fully in East Germany. And Uli ends up having a daughter in the West. I don't want to give too much away. He has a daughter in the West. Yes. And
time passes, again, things happen. Yeah.
Time passes, things happen. There's Rudy and there's Gretchen, and they're the 2 children in the story. And I did want to show, because so much of the reason the wall came down was because of the youth. With Uli and Lisa's generation, who were in their 20s when the wall went up, they were reeling, just trying to figure out what this was and what the context was. By the time the 1980s rolls around, the 1970s, 1980s, we start to see the cracks in the wall really start to form, and it forms with the youth. Specifically, it forms with the punk movement. The punk movement in East Germany was huge
Yeah.
and hugely influential. And all of these children, well, children of those who'd grown up. So Rudy is he's in his late teens when the wall comes down, or late teens, early 20s when the wall comes down. And he just becomes so disenfranchised and so disillusioned with what communism in the East German context is. Because, communism is one of those systems where at the beginning it's an ideology, it's ideal, and it makes sense, but then the wheels start to fall off the bus. You see that in every, really in so many different communist contexts. You see the start and you see the promise of it, and then roll that tape for 5-6 decades, and you see just how corrupt it is, and how how unworkable practically the system is. And so Rudy is at a point where the system has stopped working, and he is ready to tear down the wall with his own bare hands if he has to.
Yeah.
Whereas Gretchen, Uli's daughter, who grows up in the East, she grows up privileged. She grows up, kind of always seeing and wanting the best. Well, not even seeing and wanting the best. She just grows up not really knowing anything else. For her, the wall is an injustice in a completely abstract way almost.
Mm-hmm.
So when she looks at it, she says, well, of course it needs to come down. And of course it can come down, because she's never experienced the hardship, and she's never experienced the danger that it really represents, because to her, it's just there.
Yeah.
And she's never been in danger. So Uli and, so Gretchen and Rudy end up becoming kind of the reason that that there's a whole sort of third act of the book. And they become incredibly instrumental in what happens. I don't want to give too much away.
I know, it's so hard. It's so hard.
I know, it's hard to talk about it.
I really do. It's so hard to not talk about all the things that I want to talk about when I talk to authors. There's some things that I have to bring up after we're done recording or before we're done recording, because I just, you don't want to give too much away. I want you to read it and enjoy it and not have a million spoilers. But it's hard. It's very hard. But Rudy and Gretchen, I think, are really great examples of secondary characters who serve an incredibly important function within the story, and you see just a slightly different perspective, a different generational perspective from their characters and for the time period. So we're going to go ahead and take our next break of this podcast. When we come back, we're going to be seeing still more perspective, especially in terms of East Germany and some of that ideology. And we'll talk a little bit about Lisa's brother, Paul, and some of the other characters within the story. So you are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC. To access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with author Bryn Turnbull. We were talking about her historical fiction book, The Berlin Apartment. Before the break, we were talking about two secondary characters in Rudy and Gretchen. They are the children of Uli and Lisa, and they bring a different perspective. So just, a reminder as to what we were talking about that, because of course we are picking up the conversation now with this next segment. But going back to your comment about ideology and, the reasonings behind are rooted in people wanting certain things, and sometimes they do envision it as better lives. Maybe it doesn't play out that way, but they're thinking, this is corrupt. If we do it this way, it's more equal for everyone.
Yeah.
And you really see that with Lisa's brother. He's very much in that mindset of this is better, that is bad. But then you see the flip side with Rudy and how it's just crushing his soul because he doesn't get to be an individual. He doesn't get to be, the person that he would like to be because the system is set up so that everyone's equal, but not equal, but there's no
Everyone's equal, but they're not independent.
there. Yeah. Or
And yeah, and I mean, and that's the shame of it. And I think with Paul, Lisa's brother, we see a glimpse of what it could be and what it should be at the start. We see the good intentions behind a communist system. And but of course that ends up crumbling around everybody, including Paul. And I think I think that nobody goes into any situation, nobody goes into building a new political system. Like Karl Marx didn't go into it thinking, oh, this is going to be a great way for me to enrich myself and my buddies, right?
right.
That's not what the reason for it was. I think that there's always going to be an element of corruption in any political system. And so yeah, I don't know. I see the good in it, and I wanted to portray a little bit of like it wasn't all bad, but it's not workable.
Yeah.
And the less workable it becomes, the more corrupt it becomes.
Yeah.
Because people start saying, well, if I'm not gonna, if somebody else is gonna be benefiting off of my back, why don't I do the same thing?
Mm-hmm. And you really see it in that this can't be as good as you are portraying it to be if there are listening devices in my workplace and you are reading my mail and you're trying to make sure that I do not communicate with it. It was her fiance, it was the father of her child, and yet Lisa discovers that she is being watched and listened to, and everyone is being watched and listened to, and it's just indicative that this can't be as good as people want it to be.
100%. I mean, researching the Stasi was so fascinating because I knew a little bit about them, but I didn't realize how pervasive they were in people's everyday lives. Like the Stasi had, I think it was one agent for it was like 250 people, whereas the KGB was one agent for every like 850 people. Just
Wow.
the level of pervasiveness of this system. And the deal was with the Stasi, if you knew that they were there, they already had failed in their mission, because they wanted you to want to be part of this system. They wanted to coerce you into being part of it through your own sort of like almost by gaslighting you in a way. They didn't want to use force. They used force when necessary, but the deal was, if we can get you to come up to this by your own sort of not free will, but if you can understand that you are being controlled and we don't have to lift a finger, that's what we do. It was all through paranoia. So, they had the listening devices, of course. They had informants. The number of informants in East Germany was just staggering, absolutely staggering. When the Stasi Records Agency was opened after the wall came down, they found out like marriages ended because people found out that their wife was an informant or their husband was an informant. And it was just wild. But one of the things that they would do, if you were under surveillance, you wouldn't know it, but there would be kind of these signs. So, at work, you wouldn't get the promotion that you wanted. Your spouse would come with, evidence or with suspicions that you'd been cheating when you hadn't. You'd leave at the start of the day, you'd come home at the end of the day, everything would be exactly as you left it, except the brand of tea in the cupboard would be different. Or you would have left the cups turned over and they'd be the other side, they'd be the wrong way up. And it was all just kind of to make you question your own sanity, because if you're questioning your own sanity, how can you build time to like overthrow a government, right?
Yeah.
How can you be working against a system if you can't trust your own brain? It's really quite creepy.
Yeah. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's like those it's like the movies where somebody's in an abusive relationship and they come home and the towels or whatever. There's those
Yeah,
yeah, except that the abusive relationship is with your government.
yeah, 100%,
Yeah.
100%.
So
Yeah.
I can only imagine the level of research that you had to do. How do you come back out of the rabbit holes in order to start writing?
It's very hard to do because I love the research process. Like I can research a book for like 6, 7 years, just very happily. Um, with this book, a lot of the research was online. I was able to go to Berlin, love Berlin. If you ever get a chance to do the tunnel tour, do it. It's really,
Mm-hmm.
really cool.
Mm-hmm.
But with this book, because it takes place, like it's in my lived history, right? Like I was born in 1988, the wall came down in 89. And as a result, like, whereas with my other books, a lot of my research had to be memoirs and diaries and letters and everything. With this, there was so much more like lived experience to kind of draw from. There are a couple of really great websites. One of them is called the Chronique der Mauer, where it's these videos of just people talking about their experience, like 3 to 4 minute videos of people talking about their experience on either side of the wall. And like, what was it like shopping in East Germany? What were the fashions like? What was, when I went over the wall in 1972, how did I do it kind of thing? And so it was really neat to be able to have sort of that more immediate level of access to lived experiences that I was able to kind of weave into the story.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Hmm.
I was 14 when the wall came down. So again, I like when you're writing about it and you say that Tom Brokaw is reporting, I'm like, I
Yeah,
remember this. And of course I was 14, so like I knew it was important, but at 14 you're kind of you, you
yeah.
know you know something important's happening, but you're also worried about
You wanted to go back to MTV. Come on.
right, right. We didn't have
Yeah.
cable, I didn't have MTV, but I would have. But yeah, the lived experience, because I can remember, it's historical fiction, but I also remember what you're writing about, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah. I mean, all of my other books are, I consider myself an author of the early 20th century. And this book really kind of I sort of had to redefine that in my own head because I'm like, this isn't early 20th century. This is really immediate history.
Yeah. And when
Yeah.
you think of historical fiction, you often think of, further back. And so there's a point where I think Gretchen is talking about playing a cassette. I was like, wait, a cassette? This is all right. We're in the
Yeah.
80s, right?
Because I found that I was so I didn't even kind of realize I was doing it at the time, but I kept grounding myself through the music of through the musical eras.
Hmm.
So this is the most musical book that I've written. I've got actually a whole playlist on Spotify for it because so much of it was just like there's an evolution of music that's happening at the same time as the evolution of the wall is happening. And for me, that was the only way to kind of like remind myself, right, we're in 1976, we're in 1989. Jethro Tull is playing is playing at the amphitheater in Berlin. So okay, like that gives me sort of the
Yeah.
ability to think about it in a way that was a lot more immediate. And of course, music, going back to the punk thing, music was one of those things that was able to cross the wall
Hmm.
because while the East German government could control what was coming in and out of the country, they couldn't control the airwaves. So East German youth could listen to the music that was coming across, coming from the West. And that was such a resistance point, was listening to the
Yeah.
music of like Clash and Joy Division and, David Bowie and Bruce Springsteen and all of these musicians whose music spoke about, individualism and free choice. And I mean, it was incredibly political.
Yeah.
And again, it was one of the reasons why people started to really resist the government was there was music that was saying, here's another choice, here's another way of living.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
And just the way I mean, this was such a tumultuous time, most places in the world, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, like so much social
Mhm.
change happens, and the music really reflects that. So you go from Elvis to, like you said, the Clash.
Yeah.
That that's a segue.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any particular hopes for what people might take away from the book?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that really struck me when I was writing it, coming back to the fact that this was lived history in our lifetimes. One of the things that struck me is really how it's easy to overlook in our incredibly busy lives. It's easy to overlook the fact that we are all living through history at any given point, and we don't know necessarily what points of that history are going to be important. But I think that, in a time where we're seeing so much division and we're seeing so much sort of extremism on the rise, it's important to look at our own lives and how we're leading those lives and say, how can we shape our own history for the better? I think that's one of the things that really stuck with me while writing this book was these are just ordinary people who are living ordinary lives, and they stood up against injustice in a way that I would hope, if I was living in that time and place, I would have the courage to do. So that for me is what I want people to take away from this book is we have a responsibility to shape our own history for the better. Because we never know what the future historical fiction authors and historians are going to be looking at and saying, that was a touch point, that was a flashpoint, that was something that changed, that was one of the cracks that brought down the wall, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so interesting to think about lived history, what's happening in our lives and what those touch points might be. I did an interview several months ago, and the book took place during COVID, during the beginning of COVID. And that's not that long ago, but it also, in some ways, it felt like forever ago. And in some places it felt like yesterday. And that's one of those things
Totally.
that's going to be historical fiction. People are going to write about that. And in some ways it was like, wow, this is a little too soon. I'm not ready for this yet.
You know what? Good on that author for writing about it. I don't know that I'd want to go back there in for myself. I feel like that's a lot. That's a hard thing to do.
There were things that I was like, I'd kind of, how you kind of block things out that you don't want to remember. But
oh, totally. My COVID book was actually it was my novel about the Romanovs, the last Grand Duchess, and so much of the book when I read it now, because obviously the Romanovs were under house arrest for the last 18 months of their lives. So much of that, when I read that book now, it's my own anxieties because we were living through, like in Toronto, we had an 8-month lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like we had, I think, one of the hardest lockdowns in the world. And so much of it was like just me working through my own anxieties about what this means, sitting there and watching 2 years of your life just slide past, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. I will say this about COVID, though. The number of authors that I interview that talk about, and then COVID hit and I finally wrote that book that I'd been wanting to write, or, like some people made sourdough bread. Some authors wrote the book that they'd always wanted to write. So we got a lot of good stuff out of it, but.
Oh, yeah. At what cost?
Yeah, exactly. At what price exactly? But I do talk to so many authors who talk about the books that came out of COVID, and it is amazing, though, back to Bryn's point of how authors' lives and what's going on while they're writing a book might seep into or affect the writing of that book. It'd be interesting to see. There's no way to do it, but to see how a book would be written differently if it had been written at a different point in an author's life. If it wasn't COVID when Bryn wrote that book, would it have turned out slightly differently? And if so, what influences might have made that effect? I don't know. Anyway, we're going to take our final break of this podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking about what Bryn is working on now. You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, Bryn was talking about writing a book about the Romanovs, essentially being under house arrest, and how being in lockdown, there was some crossovers, and there was some interesting influences in terms of her real life experience, maybe influencing her writing experience. But let's go ahead and now get to the conclusion of this conversation with Bryn. So what era have you moved to now? What are you working on now?
So I'm actually writing two books at the moment. One is a contemporary. It's my first, it's kind of a rom-com. It's a little on the rom-com side, which I just kind of wanted to do as a palate cleanser because I was like, I had 4 books come out in 4 years, all historical fiction, all busy. And I was like, I just kind of want to do a little palate cleanser and see what comes out of it. And I'm really loving this little world. It's about, I'm not going to give too much away. It takes place in Scotland. It's a young author who moves to Scotland, and it's just a lot of fun to write. And then the other one I'm writing is a historical, and it's 1950s in Canada. My first Canadian, as a Canadian author, I'm finally writing a Canadian book. So it's 1950s cottage country.
Okay.
Is where I'm going.
Yeah, I can see, Lise and Uli have an epic sort of romance, but it's not really fun. So I can understand wanting to write a relationship that's just a little lighter.
You know what? It's funny. One of the I don't log into I don't read a ton of the reader reviews, but one of my friends sent me one which said this is very much not a romance. It's a love story, but it's not a romance.
No, it's not.
Some reader said, and I thought that was a very apt distinction because it's an incredibly epic love story, but it's not an easy one, that's for sure. It's not hearts and flowers and butterflies. Yeah.
No, but I mean, hey, he digs her a tunnel, or he tries to dig her a tunnel. I mean, that's something.
Well, you know what? You can get the diamond ring, or you can get the tunnel, and they're both. What is it like? The 5 love languages. One is gift giving. One is digging
acts
a
of
tunnel.
service, digging. Yeah, the 6th, tunnel digging.
It's a heck of an act of service.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So that's what you've been writing. What have you been reading lately?
I have been reading. I've kind of been all over the place because I'm not on deadline right now, and so I'm able. Like I've got this TBR stack that's like this high, which I have been sort of slowly working my way through. Right now, I am reading a book called O Caledonia, which I just picked up. It's a Scottish Gothic novel. I think it came out in like 1991, and it was recently reissued. And Sarah Perry wrote the foreword to it, and I love her work. So I kind of figure we're going into spooky season, kind of fun to dip my toe in with that. Which I'm really loving. I just finished Kate Quinn's The Briar Club, which was fabulous. I love basically everything that Kate writes, and this is just no exception, top of her game as always. So yeah, those are the two that I'm working that stick out at the moment. But yeah.
Okay. You mentioned before we started recording that you're hanging out with your niece, who's 2.5. Are you reading anything fun with her? I love board books. What can I say?
Yes. Of course. Yeah, she's very fun. I'm babysitting at the moment, so this is my brother's little herb garden back there. Yeah, so we've been reading, there's this book, it's called Buttercup. Buttercup the Bigfoot. That's the one. And it's about a little girl who has a different name in the book, but we call her Rosie because it's my niece's name. Rosie ends up going into the mountains because she's bored. She goes into the mountains, she finds a Bigfoot named Buttercup.
Oh, sure.
And they become best friends. And it is the greatest book to read with children because every other page is just a roar. And so you get to roar your little, lungs out along with Buttercup. And it's just very fun. So, yeah.
Nice. You can scream into the void and bond with your niece. It's good.
Exactly. Double duty. It's wonderful.
I like it. If people want to know more about you and your books, internet, so website and any social media that you're active on.
Yeah. So I am at my website is brynturnbull.com, and I'm most active in terms of social media on Instagram and Facebook. So I'm at Bryn Turnbull Writes. Yeah.
Easy enough.
Mhm.
Bryn, we've talked about a few things, but is there anything that we have not covered that you wanted to make sure you highlighted?
Not particularly. I mean, I feel like you've asked some really fabulous questions, so thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate taking time out of, because you are babysitting, I appreciate taking the time away from that to talk to me about the Berlin apartment and writing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, no, she's got another hour on her nap, so
Oh, good. So you have some
gotta go
downtime.
crack a book and make a cup of tea.
Good, good.
Yeah.
Thank you again to Bryn for joining me for this second interview to talk about the Berlin apartment. I greatly appreciate it. As I said before, I really, really enjoyed this book. If you are a fan of historical fiction, if you want to learn more about the Berlin Wall and its history and the effect it had on people living in both East and West Berlin at the time, then this is definitely one that you will want to pick up. It is, like I said, fast-paced. It sucked me right in. I read it in about 2 days, and just even though I suspected what was going to happen with a certain part of the book, I still had to get there. I had to have those suspicions confirmed. I had to find out, and then once I did find out, then I had to keep going and find out where things were going to go next. So very fast paced. I learned a lot that I didn't know or maybe had forgotten, and it brought back just once we got at the end when the wall falls in the book, remembering that time and watching it on the news, etc. So if you're a fan of historical fiction, definitely check this one out. Or maybe you know someone who is a fan of historical fiction and they would want to check it out as well. Or she's got 3 other books that you can read. So if you're looking for a new historical fiction author, that's always great to find someone that has multiple books that you can read immediately. I hope that you will join me next week. We're switching gears. So this week, historical fiction. Next week, we are moving on to nonfiction. I'll be speaking with A. Ashley Hoff about the book With Love, Mommy Dearest. This is about the making of the movie Mommy Dearest, which itself was based on a memoir written in the 70s by Christina Crawford, who was the daughter of Joan Crawford. You may or may not know her as a very famous actor of her time. The movie itself became infamous for all kinds of reasons that they were not expecting in the making of it, and the making of this movie was a trip. I'm really looking forward to talking to Ashley and learning about his experiences and researching this book. So if you are at all interested in this movie, you're definitely going to want to join me for this conversation, because like I said, the making of this movie was quite the experience for everyone involved, and looking forward to that conversation. Thank you again for joining me for this episode. As always, a reminder, if you're not doing so already, please like, follow, and subscribe on whatever platform you are listening to or watching this episode on. It does really help the algorithm get this podcast out to more readers such as yourselves. Also, leaving a positive review is incredibly helpful to the algorithm, and I greatly appreciate that. Just like you leave reviews for your favorite books, that really helps the authors as well. You can also follow the podcast on social media, Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok. Love hearing from you, so find the podcast on social media, hit me up with questions, tell me what you've been reading, etc., etc. I hope your week is going really well. I hope that no matter what this week throws at you, it throws you plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to